Hello, sense makers, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourself, a podcast about the hard work it takes to figure out who you are and what you want in this world. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfi and Abby. Before we get into this month's show, I want to shout out everyone who has been joining the Sense Makers Club monthly membership community since we launched earlier this month. I also want to take the opportunity to tell you about the club membership in case you haven't heard about it, or in case you're hovering on the join button as I'm speaking. We are hosting 20 monthly topic-based discussion groups, which means we host a live, peer-led discussion on a new topic every single weekday. I run two of those groups myself, one on information architecture, the other on diagramming, and Alfie co-hosts a group on relationship building and networking. And there are 30-something other amazing discussion leaders who have been trained by me to lead inclusive, safe discussions on topics like being an introvert in an extrovert's world, the role of metaphor in facilitation, the overlaps of mindfulness and modeling, and even how to hack bureaucracy, just to name a nerdy few. So if you're looking to feel a sense of community and you want to connect with some really smart, thoughtful, introspective nerds, I really hope that Alfie and I will see you at the club soon. In this episode, we're going to be talking about uncovering our own personal values, how to find out what your values are, how to shed the values that are no longer serving you, and how to build realistic values-based decision-making into your life. It is a thought-provoking episode, so grab a pen and some paper, and let's get into it. To start us off, I want to talk about how we ended up talking about personal values to begin with. Alfie, do you remember the story of how we got here?
Yeah. Hey everyone, and thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because if we think about the context of the program to begin with, we started off with a little bit of work around timelines and kind of looking back into your past, and then you kind of went through this detailed sort of self introspection, writing a little bit about your own experiences and some of the things that have been significant to you as an individual. And from the beginning of us working together on this program, the intention was always for it to have some kind of practical aspect of you being able to project yourself into the future and project the growth that you wanted. But we sort of felt that it was a little bit difficult to go from looking backwards and self-reflection directly into planning forward into the future. We kind of felt like we needed something in the middle that can kind of let you take stock of where you are right now and use that as a foundation to build onto where you want to go. And that's really, I think, what kind of started this process off. And, funnily enough, you might not expect it, but this process started in Pinterest. Abby, I don't know if you want to share a little bit of how exactly we went from Pinterest to a program about defining your values.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. The Pinterest story. I think that really is a good example of like going to the source in terms of like, we knew that we wanted to lead people through a values discovery exercise, but we also knew that there was like a lot of kind of like garbage versions of that, which was just give people a really big list of words and then tell them to pick some values from the list of words. So we started on Pinterest because a lot of those things are pinned in Pinterest, and the self-help community has really like taken a lot of stock in visualizing those things to kind of draw people in. So the first step that I took in trying to kind of make a tool for our students to figure out their own values was I went and looked at all of the different versions that I could find. And Pinterest seemed to be a really good one because it kind of like brought a lot of the trends to the top. And so the first part of my process was actually taking screenshots of all of the values based word piles that I could find through Pinterest and also just like on the web in general. And then I put them in through Google Photos and I used the text retrieval tool there. And I just grabbed all of the words and I threw them into a spreadsheet. And then once I had them in the spreadsheet, I was able to dedupe it so I could get to a list of like all unique words. And then once I had the list of all unique words, what had started as a list of 1,000, which felt like, uncomfortably long, was now like a little shy of 300 and felt much more approachable. So yeah, I think that words are really hard. Like if you give people a list of 300 words, even without further sorting, which we'll talk about, that's too much. And 1,000, that's way too much. So I felt like having 300 to start with was a good set. And I felt fairly sure that it was a good starting place. And also that just like having a list does make it easier. Like there's something about having too long a list, but then I also think the same can be true of having no list at all, where it's like that's also impossible. So kind of striking what is the balance of the right length for this list of words was the first important step, I think.
No, I think you're totally right, and I'm super grateful that you were willing to take this part of the process on, because I don't know
Willing,
whether I would have been
honestly.
able to.
Oh my gosh, Alfie, don't even. You think that you didn't like that I'm doing you a favor? That was like so fun. That was a really fun day in my office. The day I got to steal all the words from Pinterest for this. So yeah,
And
no.
I guess,
Yeah,
that's another example of how you and I kind of play to each other's differences and strengths.
big time. Yeah.
But I mean, 300 words, as you mentioned, is like a huge step forward in terms of the initial 1,000, but 300 is still quite a lot. I
Yes.
don't know if you want to share like how we kind of took the next step, because I mean, presenting a student with 300 is a little bit hectic. So can you talk
Yeah.
a little bit about the next step?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I want to just point out how this is like classic information architecture. Like the idea is always that you have way too much stuff and you have to make categories or determinations about the way that that stuff is going to get framed so that people don't feel overwhelmed by it and that it doesn't paralyze them from whatever their action is. So I feel like this was something that I was born to do it, which is great. I feel like the other thing that I want to say first is how values are really useless unless the words that we're choosing for them are really meaningful. So it's not just that we need to pick words, it's that we need to pick the right words. And I feel like in order to pick the right words, you need like some kind of guiding questions, some kind of a prompt.
Yeah.
So I started to look at things in terms of these lists of words that I had, the 300, and I started to compare the 300 to each other and try to see like, what are these words describing, right? And I came up with five kind of categories. So there was words that were introspective, so they were how we think about ourselves or how we think about our own life story. There was words that were about our intention and like how we aim to impact the world. There was words that were like about our interpersonal relationships and how we interact with and treat other people. There was other words that were really about like an investment, like how we are investing our time, our money, our skills, our energy. And then lastly, there was this infrastructure kind of question about like how we use or don't use the things that are given to us or the systems and resources that are right in front of us. So from that list, I was able to kind of like reverse engineer questions to try to get our students to be thoughtful about those five categories. So the five questions that I ended up with are the first one is, which values do you aspire to see in yourself? And this is really around those intrapersonal values. So it's asking you to look at yourself aspirationally. It's sort of like the what would you want on your tombstone kind of question, which I think is an important one for this part of a process. The next one is around the values that you aspire to in how you relate to others. So this one is kind of coupled with the first one because this is where the first one's intrapersonal. This is the interpersonal. So how do you want to be when facing things with other people? And those two things can be really different. And I think that like just the value of identifying that has been really impactful to me, but also I think for our students.
So I think maybe it might be good for us to just pause in between those first two categories before we get to the next three. Because one of the things that was significant for me in this part of the process is I don't have the same sort of association or experience with the words as you might. And so I found it to be quite difficult to find meaning in simply selecting words. It might be partly also because I've got a lot more visual and kind of like, or at least in the way that I think about things, it's a lot more visual and spoken. So one of the things that I found a lot of value in is kind of having a question with which to frame the words that you're going to select. And I found what that did is it sort of forces you as the person going through this to place your own meaning in the answer. Because like, yes, you're selecting a word, but when you've got a question, it's a lot easier to compare different words and kind of see the context of what it means to you as an individual, and then sort of lead you down the path of kind of finding a little bit more clarity. And you know, especially, and maybe this might be something that I'd like to get your perspective on. You know, the question about introspective versus intrapersonal values versus interpersonal values.
Mhm.
One of the things that's interesting to me is kind of like how, though they are so similar, you might want or desire something completely different. So I don't know if you have any of your examples in terms of either one of those first two that that resonated at
Yeah.
that point in time.
Yeah, no, the answers for mine, I think, are a really good example because they're definitely related to one another, but they're related to one another in interesting, complex ways, I would say. So my answer, for example, the one that I came to that I prioritize in intrapersonal values is authenticity. And that's how I want to see myself. Like, but authenticity is not just about myself, it's also about how I show up in the world. So, when I look at my own authenticity, it's very related to what I chose for my interpersonal value, which was community. And so the interchange between those two things, I think, is really interesting because I need community in order to have a place to show up authentically. And I need to have authenticity to end up in the communities where I'm going to be the most valued and the most loved for who I am. So I think like those things are really related, and I think that was probably shared with a few other students as well, where you kind of saw like patterns between the things.
Yeah. You know, when I think about how I thought about those first two categories, it was quite interesting because you might say that they're almost the same value, simply just flipped with different subjects. Because in terms of like what I value from an internal perspective is a lot more about being visionary and kind of being able to look forward and imagine something that might be beneficial to a group or community as a whole. So though it's what I value intrapersonally, it
Mhm.
still speaks to my desire from an external perspective. And then when I look at the way I'd like to, or what I value from an interpersonal perspective, how I'd like to sort of engage with the groups or communities that I engage with, it's a lot more focused around openness and sort of receiving information or receiving alternate perspectives. And,
Mhm.
it's kind of like the two of those things work very strongly together because to be able to kind of come up with something that you might call visionary, you kind of need to get a lot of different perspectives and see things from other people's point of view to kind of see like what are other people missing. And so I think these
Yeah.
first two categories actually work very well together and give you a
Mhm.
good sort of framing of both how you want to look at yourself and how you want to kind of like engage with other people. And so maybe from there you can share with us like what the next three sort of questions that were framing the
Yeah.
values.
Yeah. So the third one is, which values do you aspire to when making a decision? So this really comes down to your motivation and specifically how you're motivated to change, because some people are motivated by things intrinsically, some people are better motivated extrinsically, and so there's a lot to be said about like when you're being faced with a decision, like how are you making that call? Like my particular answer to that was kindness. Like I feel like approaching decisions with kindness as the center has been something that's really done me well. It's done me a kindness, if you will. And so yeah, I feel like that one was a really important touchstone for a lot of folks. The next one is, which values do you aspire to when things are going wrong? So this is very much related to your motivations, but this is like when things are at the worst, like what is your disposition? And I think like when you look at conflict or facing hardship, like having the ability to see what your values look like in that light, I think is a really powerful thing. This one was probably the hardest for me to answer. And I ended up picking curiosity. And I think that of all of the values that I have come out of this process with, that was the one that surprised me the most in terms of its relationship to when things are going wrong. Because I had never made that relationship before in my brain that, like, when things are going wrong, getting curious is actually one of the most powerful things that I'm able to do as a sense maker. But I had never put it in those terms for myself. And I think that was really, yeah, that was really changing for me. How
Yeah.
about you? Before we go on to the last one, I'd be interested for hearing um, your answers to these. It's been a while, so revisiting this is sort of fun.
The thing that's crazy to me is like they feel like they fit better now that I've had space from this than when I'd initially kind of come up with them. Because as I mentioned, me and words have got a strange relationship. But now coming back
Yes.
and actually looking at this and looking through how many ups and downs I've gone through over the past couple of months since we did this, it's like it feels like it's just hitting that much more.
It's been
And so
six
I think
months. I
especially
want to call that out. I want to call you out because it's been 6 months since we did this. So I want to stop because I feel like you've grown so much in the last 6 months. Myself too. Like I feel like I had the same reaction when I was preparing for this episode where I was like, oh my gosh, like I, I'm like living into these values in a way that I didn't think that I would have been when we made the list. When we made the list, it was more about like testing the tools for students and like we were getting stuff out of conversing with each other and getting to know one another through conversing about our peership and our values and stuff. But the idea that this exercise actually pushed us to set values that felt on the edge of uncomfortable 6 months ago, and now they feel like an old shoe that we're just like slipping on in. It's so cool, Alfie. Like that's so
yeah.
cool. Yeah, I'm sorry to
No, that
interrupt, but I
is
just I couldn't let that go. That was just like, yeah.
no. I think you're totally right, and I think when I kind of get to the next part of this conversation, I've got a little story to share from a dinner that I had the other day. But before I get
Oh,
ahead of
dinner.
myself, one of the things that was cool to me is like where where I sort of lean in when things are going wrong. When things are going wrong, either for me or in the context that I am generally,
Mhm.
is that I specifically value collaboration, which is a little bit strange because especially being an extrovert and the fact that I love talking and I love engaging with people is you might think that when things are going right is when I want to be with other people. But I find it
Mhm.
a lot more valuable when things are going wrong because what tends to happen when things are going wrong is I start to doubt myself because if I look at the sort of previous value, which is about what I value when making decisions,
Mhm.
it's a lot more focused around intuition and kind of like going with my gut and going with the flow, and is a
Yes.
lot more focused around like my internal senses. But
Mm.
when when that intuition sometimes lead me astray, I kind of need to ground myself again. And so being able to engage with other people and talk through my thinking and to be able to articulate things that might previously have been intuitive and putting words to them to ground them actually helps me so much in terms of navigating the complexities of a crisis or the anxiety that comes with things not necessarily going right. So it's like, and when I now think about some of the sort of, you know, dips that I've had over the past couple of months, knowing that that is how I should approach the challenges or the things that are going wrong saves me from a lot of like self-flagellation and like just
Yeah.
beating myself up because things are going wrong. And I like kind of know, because I took the time to think through this, is like when things are going wrong, talk about it. Find somebody
Mhm.
who, has got the foundational understanding of who I am and how I approach things, who can kind of give me the space to talk through the challenge and talk through the thinking that is eventually led me to that decision. Because I think what I kind of realized is I also can't just talk to anybody about this. It kind of needs to be a person who has got an understanding of how I make my decisions, and the fact that I kind of typically lean into intuitive thinking rather than like a kind of procedural or structured kind of approach, so that I
Mhm.
can actually talk through what was intuitive in a way that kind of makes it a little bit more tangible and a little bit clearer to me.
Yeah. No, it's that collaboration part that you're saying. Like, it's not just about talking to somebody about your feelings, it's about finding a willing collaborative partner to work through the feelings that you're having and the thoughts that you're having towards some sort of like a mutual resolution. And I see a lot of that in you, especially in the last 6 months. I feel like that's really blossomed. So man, this is
Yeah.
this is very cool. I might have a little tear moment. We'll see. All right. So then the last one is, which values do you aspire to when things are going right. So we talked about wrong. Let's talk about right. In the case of right, the things that we're really looking at is your mission derived values. Like, how do you want to be when things are optimal, when things are going really well? Like, what does that look like for you? The word that I ended up choosing was also very surprising to me, but I chose playfulness because I think that that's a value that I would like to grow in my life, but it's also one that when I felt the most joy, that's the feeling that I have is like a playfulness, not just like at play, but also in my work, in decision making, in how I approach other people. So yeah, what was your answer for the right? That was the collaboration. The collaboration was
Yeah.
wrong, so right.
So I think one of the ones for me that is maybe I don't know if I'm being a little bit too critical, but comes a little bit less naturally, but which I aspire to more is focusing on being generous in those moments specifically. And, again, it's kind of like generosity has got many, like, it's easy for it to kind of just be this esoteric and like hypothetical thing.
Yeah.
But I think why I sort of aspire to that specifically when things are going right is like success shared is multiplied. It's
Mm.
like winning is great, but winning with people that you care about and who've worked together with you on a thing is much, much, much better. And
Yeah.
and I think it's also a great way, in some sense, to build the network of people who you will eventually approach when things are going wrong. When I do need somebody to kind of talk through something, and I do need to lean on other people a little bit. Like, I want it to be a situation where I'm not just being like I think one of the terms that you shared with me a while ago is like an emotional vampire. It's kind of like I want it to be something that's
Yeah.
reciprocal. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and so to be able to do that, I kind of need to invest in the people who I would need to lean on in harder times. And so I try to very intentionally sort of share success, so that in harder times I can also lean on other people.
That is such a good lesson just in community in general. And like not just in, the value of having it, but like in the danger of not having it. It's sort of like because you mentioned the emotional vampire, it's like one of the parts of that metaphor that's the most insidious is that like they're coming out of nowhere and then they're sucking your blood. Like you don't see it coming. That doesn't happen twice. You know what I mean? And like to be like that in somebody's life, I think a lot of us find ourselves in that position when we haven't built that community, when we don't have those relationships that we can rely on when things are going wrong. And so like everything is just in that like, oh, we'll just plan for everything going right. And everything's cool when you're alone and things are going right. It's when things are going wrong and you're alone. You're like, oh no, I need collaborators. I need somebody to see me. And that's not a really good time to like start a relationship with someone
Yeah.
or ask for help from somebody that you don't have a relationship with. So yeah, it brings to mind like how important it is when things are going well to be investing in the infrastructure for when things are going to go wrong because they
Yeah.
will. We're humans.
No, 100%. So, at this, if we kind of like look at the larger sort of process, at this point in time, most of the students will have had like 3 to 5 words, which they kind of use these questions to narrow down on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the questions played a significant part of that.
Yeah.
But I think, the sort of like the next part, which to me is a little bit interesting, is kind of like, how do you now go from like this 5 to 3 words to actually start to put intention and meaning behind that? So can you share a little bit
Yeah.
about how we took that next step of narrowing down things to something that can now be usable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first thing we had them do was answer each of these questions with 3 to 5 words. So we knew that coming to one word on any of these questions from the very beginning would be nearly impossible. So coming out of that first kind of like answering the questions stage, you should have somewhere between 15 and 25 words if you followed the directions of 3 to 5. if you then get into that list, what we've encouraged our students to do is to dig into what they consider the top three. So for some of them, you might already just have three, but for some, you might have to make some cuts at that point. And then we recommended that they do a deep dive on each of those 15 terms that they're left with. And we had a bunch of guiding questions in the workbook aspect of this. So we had questions like what connotations or associations or vibes might you have with this value, or what do you see as the potential opposites of this value was a really useful question. What other words come to mind when you think about this value? Kind of like searching for synonyms, almost testing whether or not they've picked the right word or if they're just like in the word family at this point, which I think was a really useful exercise for people to kind of like get outside of just that initial list of 300 and kind of make the words their own. But we also asked about like what it would mean to hold the value in their day-to-day life. Like, did it seem like a value they could actually like carry around with them as a tool? Or did it seem too aspirational or not based on enough actual value? And then we asked them about like, can you think of a time when this value showed up in someone else in a way that you admire? Or can you think of a time that this came up in your own life that made you admire yourself? So getting them to kind of like think on each of these 15. And we did some pairing of people. So they had some time with a stranger peer. And just had them kind of like have a conversation about that list of 15 and using another person to kind of figure out what that list of 15 words says about an individual and kind of how do you narrow from there. And so we got them to the place where they each had like, you know, those 15 explored. And then it felt like we could start to get to, okay, pick one. Like pick one and then don't only pick it, but be able to use it in a sentence. So we gave them like a fill-in sentence. And the sentence was, I value blank because blank. And it was very open-ended, but I think, Alfie, would you mind sharing some of yours and then I'll share some of mine?
Yeah. No, definitely. And I have to just maybe touch on the fact that I think, especially the process of being able to talk to somebody about these values, I think was extremely useful because you know it's one thing to in the safety of your room write a little bit about you know what you value, but it's a completely different experience needing to actually put words to that and stand by it.
Yes.
And so
We had a lot of, I would say, of all of the course sessions, I want to say that this one was the one that people got like choked up the most. We definitely had like a couple of people that were like, I was crying unexpectedly, and because a lot of them had written them alone in their room, and then they had to say them out loud to another human being for the very first time, and that can be very, very powerful. I remember feeling like that when we were discussing these, and like, yeah, the first time some of these
yeah,
things come out, it can be really impactful.
definitely. And you know maybe just one last thing before I dive into mine. I think for me, especially in this fill in the blank situation, I realized that the sort of the sentence that is the reason for the value was actually the part that really allows you to imbue a part of yourself in the word. And so I'll sort of start off with a couple of mine. So the first one I mentioned is I value being visionary because I feel as though it's needed for my own sake, but maybe even more importantly, it's needed for my generation as a whole because we're starved of a positive vision. And I kind of maybe want to talk about that one a little bit before I go on further, because I think one of the things I've learned over the past 3 or 4 years is kind of like, you know, the things that you have and the things that you've achieved are great when you kind of introduce yourself to somebody new or like you're engaging with people. It's like, it's great to kind of like talk about all your credentials or your, you know, the stripes that you've earned. But if you don't have something that's kind of worth fighting for in the future, it's really difficult to kind of like stay steadfast in the face of like an unexpected challenge. And so for me, this has been a really important one, is kind of like having a vision for a future that's worth fighting for. Like
Yeah.
that has been a significant part, especially over the past year and a bit since I kind of like started this journey of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, no, I can
let
definitely
me
see that.
not go on for too long on that one.
No, I'm really glad that you brought that up. I hadn't really thought about that as like, yeah, and how that ended up being one of your core values. And I do think that a lot of how you approach everything comes from that standpoint of like you're always the person that's asking, where is this headed? Where are we trying to go to? What's the vision? So yeah, I appreciate being reminded of this about you. It's nice.
Yeah. And then the second one, I value openness as it enables me to connect and engage with a broad range of people, especially those who have something to teach me. Learning is a significant part of my life and my professional goals, both my own learning and other people's learning. And I think for a long time, kind of because the straight and narrow path into education wasn't so clear to me, kind of needing to find alternate routes has always been a central part of who I am and what I value in myself.
Yeah.
And then I'll maybe touch on one more because I feel like I could talk about all of these forever. I'll maybe go with, yeah, with intuition. So I value intuition because I found that many important moments require action without all of the facts. And in those situations specifically, it's only intuition and ethics that are going to guide you.
Yeah.
And I think a great example is like from a technological perspective is where we are with artificial intelligence. It's like the industry is moving so quickly that we can't really as a society be making decisions based on facts because it's so new and it's so outside of the realm of understanding. And so instead it's really just the intuition and ethical map that the people who are building these technologies, like that's all they can really use to guide themselves. And so this has
Yeah.
been a significant, quite a significant value for me, and kind of like in how I'm sort of approaching the future and this kind of new direction I'm taking professionally.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad that you pointed that out because that's so true. Like I think a lot of people are walking around with feelings, not facts. Whether or not you know them, yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. I don't know if you want to maybe share a couple of the examples that you
Yeah,
had.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, let me share a couple of mine. So, since we talked about authenticity, let me cover that one. So, I wrote, I value authenticity because I didn't find myself until my 30s, and I never want to lose myself again. I feel like I honestly did not know who I was as a person until very late in my life. I feel like 3 decades in is too long to not know. And so, yeah, I feel like having that compass of authenticity and checking in with myself to make sure it is still myself and not some people pleasing version of myself has been really important. I think it also relates a lot to like understanding my neurodivergence and really like staying authentic to what I know about myself and not picking up the bad habits of berating myself for the way that my brain works and like what my body needs. So I think that that really relates a lot. I wrote, I value community because I've struggled my whole life to feel like I fit in or matter. So that one's like real kind of like deep cuts from childhood, from adolescence, and just yeah, feeling like I was a little bit on the outside. And so it's not surprising to me that I've made community such a heavy focus of myself, my life, my work. And then I wrote, I value kindness because it is not my default training. And that one might have enough said, but I'll say a couple sentences more. I was definitely raised in a home where kindness was not valued. Kindness was going to get you picked on and taken advantage of. And so, yeah, I feel like it's something that I grew up in a way that I was afraid of kindness. But when I found kindness later in life, it was like a superpower that I could use to fight back even that initial system, which is cool. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think, yeah, I'll stop there. I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I want to talk about like the experience of like the value setting exercise. I mean, you shared a little bit as we've gone through the different steps, but like, yeah, what did this feel like to go through? There's a lot of like me giving you lists of words and being like, test this version, test this version. Like, what did that, what was that like?
I think the thing for me that was the most surprising about this is time and time again, I expected it to be like, hey, can you review this, this worksheet or this, question set of questions that the trainees will need to do, and expecting that coming in, and instead being confronted with significant parts of myself. I think that to me had been the most surprising part of this, just because it's like it's a list of words. You don't expect to be facing existential questions from a simple list of words. But it's like going through the process of selecting the ones that are meaningful and then comparing the meaning attached to each one of these words and why one is more significant than the other, time and time again, was shocking to me.
Yeah.
And I would say, especially because especially because the idea of values gets misused so much in the professional space. It's sort of like always like, on every single company's website, it's like, this is our mission, this is our values. And then there's a whole bunch of words which doesn't mean anything to any specific person. And so
Yeah.
kind of like coming into this with the approach of understanding that that's not what we wanted this to be. And
Mm.
it being values that represent me as an individual, I think it kind of, maybe that is one of the reasons why it was able to kind of bring these existential questions to me in a way that I could kind of face and tackle. So I'd say on the whole, it was surprising but beneficial kind of getting through it.
Yeah, I feel like that mirrors the experience that I had as well as the students. And I would almost say like, yeah, if you go through this kind of an exercise and the list that you end up with doesn't feel a little existentially uncomfortable along the way, like you might not be pushing yourself far enough.
Mm.
Like that might not actually be the set of values that you're aspiring to. I think that like the word aspire was in all five of those questions for a very good reason. We're not documenting who you've been up to this moment. We're trying to figure out who you're trying to become, who you want to be next. Like every moment we're becoming whatever's next. And so, yeah, I think that like that aspiration part was a really important pivot, especially coming out of such a period of introspection and looking back. It was like you said at the beginning, they had just like done all this looking back. And now it was about like starting to look forward. Before we get into the next part of this process, I did pull a couple of my favorite quotes from students after this part. So
Mm.
one person said, "I found myself needing two or more words. What I want to say is where the terms overlap." So we definitely had more than one student kind of describe this like Venn diagram kind of quality to some of these words, where they were like, "I don't know what the word is, but if I overlap these two words, it's that." And a little tip for our listeners is we actually recommended that you use a chat, like a LLM chat, like ChatGPT, to ask for words that are at the intersection of terms, because it's something that like that bot has access to way more words than you do. And yeah, it can be a really interesting thought starter. And we did have some success with students that were feeling that, kind of being like, yeah, ChatGPT was able to tell me the right word that kind of fit. And then my all-time favorite quote was, "At a certain point, I went rogue." And I think that like that was a really important lesson for me as an information architect to remember, because my job here was not clean data, right? My job here was not to get every single person to pick from the list of 300 words that I gave them and to settle on those words. My job was to inspire them to answer these questions as truthfully and meaningfully as possible. And if my list of 300 words and five questions got them to do that, it didn't matter to me like how they got there. And some of my favorite going rogue examples was, do you remember one of the students drew pictures representing all of their values? And it was like they were all gumball machines.
Yes, that was
Versions of
so
the
amazing.
gumball machine based on how they felt about these values. And it was so beautiful because it was so meaningful to them. And you could just tell that it was something that they were dwelling on in that like existential way that
Mm,
inspires change, that inspires us to think a little bit differently. So yeah, I think
yeah.
I learned that it was more like a domino rally and less like paper dolls. I was not going to be able to dress these people in the exact outfits that I had planned, but I could like set off the first domino and
Hmm.
have like a lot of change be the result of that, which was cool.
No, 100%. It was so cool to see how, the deviation from the set path that people were
Mhm.
kind of going into.
Yeah.
And so, as I've touched on a couple of times in this conversation, words are difficult. And I think for a lot of students, this was one of the most challenging parts because you're really trying to draw on a lot of different experiences to try to come to one word and one
Yeah.
sort of like supporting reason behind that word. But then it was sort of like the next step was one of the parts that I think a lot of students found to be the most beneficial or enjoyable. And so, do you mind talking us a little bit through this idea of continuums? And then maybe how we kind of added another spin onto that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these balancing continuums is what I've been referring to them as, is probably one of the most important things that you and I have developed together. And I think that it really was like the blend of our superpowers. And so a continuum, let me start there. A continuum is a really classic IA or strategy based tool where you have a line, it's got points on it, and those points represent directional places that one might go with a strategy, with a decision, what have you. And you kind of can use that to place yourself on a line and say, this is where I'm at today. And then you can use another line to say, this is where I would like to be. And you can talk about like the difference between those 2 points and what you would have to do to go from one to the next. So the very first version that I brought to Alfie was like that. It had all of the kind of words that you had chosen as the thing that you wanted to become. And then it had you describing sort of where you were now in comparison to that. And we talked about it, and it was sort of like one of those, yeah, okay, this works, I guess. But there was something that Alfie brought up in that session that really changed things, which was you said, I don't think that there's going to be a time where everyone is going to live on all of their values consistently all of the time, and like how will we deal with that? And it was like a very it seemed like a really simple question at the beginning, and then I realized that what continuums do is they allow a strategy to be displayed, like when you're moving an organization from one place to the next, but that people cannot move like that. That people are constantly making mushy tactical and strategic decisions about themselves all of the time. And so, yeah, we kind of came into this idea of what would it look like instead of like arriving at your value eventually after work? What would it be like if we lived while balancing all of our values and remaining as balanced on those values as we could? And so what we ended up doing was developing 3-point continuums where there's a point on each end and then there's a point at the center. And the center represents the value that you've chosen, that like list of 5 words. And then on the left-hand side, we've asked you to describe what would it look like if you undervalued that value? Like, what would it look like if that balance was out of alignment in a way that you had cared about it too little? And then on the right-hand side, we ask you about what it would look like if you overvalued that value. So, for example, in my life, community is one of the values that I chose. If I undervalue community, what does that look like? That looks like isolation. And that has been a tactic that I have used, especially when I'm going through hard things and don't feel like I have that sense of community. And then what's the overvalued version of that? I came to maybe a surprising term, but the term I came to was invaluable. And this actually is a term that I will give credit to Whitney Hess from a talk that she gave in 2010 in Phoenix, Arizona at the IA Summit. She talked about how becoming invaluable was so dangerous, especially in information architecture work. And I've taken that on in my life ever since as sort of a charge to remove myself from the process as things get closer to resolution. And so understanding the balance of that with community was really impactful for me in this exercise, where it was like I'd always thought about invaluable as it related to my consulting clients or my corporate job or my volunteerism. But I saw how it was actually directly related to my ability to hold that sense of community. Because even amongst friends and loved ones, if there's ever a time where I am given too much and I'm making myself feel invaluable, that also comes with other really bad results like resentment, and holding back real emotions and people pleasing and all these other things. So, yeah, I feel like it was really impactful to kind of like think through this tool that I had used really successfully in corporate consulting and then look at it so differently, but still really similarly, with this like tweak for,
Hmm.
yeah, for our students to kind of get through this really complex thing of figuring out how
Yeah.
to live in values. So,
No, 100%. And one of the things that appreciated the most about this is like how tangible this idea of balancing continuums made something that can seem so vague and metaphorical. And so,
yeah,
can you maybe talk us through, like, with these balancing continuums, is like how can we actually use them to make decisions in a way
yeah,
that kind of aligns with the values that we have?
yeah. I actually thought for this part, I would maybe share my screen. All right. So, this is a good example, from another one of mine. So, one of the things that we had students do was not just define kind of what the undervalued word was, and the overvalued word, but we also asked them to come up with a list of signs that future you could look out for to know that you were actually like getting into this range of either being out of, like undervalued or overvalued on your kind of aspirational value. So, starting in the center, if I'm authentic, the signs that I look for are feeling no regret when I'm hitting send or post or saying goodbye. It's wanting to talk about what's going on in my life with those that are close to me and not like kind of doing the, yeah, I'm fine. And then it's feeling free to talk without some sort of like a spin on things or without some sort of like a predetermined message. So just being able to show up and talk for myself. But if you look at the undervalued version of that, things can get kind of crafted, right? The things I look for is when I say I'm fine, when I am indeed not fine. This is often an instance where I am moving away from my authentic self and I have this like crafted reality of hiding what's really going on with me. I also see this in doing it for the plot, like making decisions because it would be good for my career or my relationship with a certain person or whatever it is. Like doing it just to progress the narrative, I think has been a really valuable pattern for me to identify. And then editing out the rawest parts, like when I find myself taking out the pain so that I can tell other people about what happened, that often is me letting go of my authenticity as well. And then on the overshare side, the signs that I look for is, feeling regret, like feeling like I shouldn't have hit send, or I shouldn't have posted that, or it was weird when I said goodbye to that person. This can also look like dumping on other people, like emotional dumping, adding details and facts where they aren't actually needing. So like just telling too much. So really like that oversharing idea. And I think that this is like something that in terms of decision making, like I've been able to use this really, specifically to like figure out what to do in my life when things come up. Like I remember very soon after you and I developed this tool, I had to decide whether or not I was going to take a speaking engagement during a time when I was going to have family out of town. And I used my set of continuums to like figure that out. And I remember you and I had this conversation where we walked through that whole thing. And like, to be honest, the primary emotion that I remember there was like, gosh darn it, this thing is calling me out like so hard on all of my bull crap. But now I see, looking back on the decisions that I've made with this tool, I just really see how much more true to like what I want and what I need those decisions ended up being. And then ultimately, like I started the Sense Makers Club because it aligns so well with these values of authenticity, community, kindness, curiosity, playfulness. So yeah, I have these 5 taped to my monitor. And I think they'll be taped there for forever until I decide to have different ones, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so crazy how like something that seems so hypothetical can become such a strong practical guide. And maybe before I dive into one of my examples, one of the things I'll just talk very briefly to is like I think in terms of this entire part of the process, for me specifically, writing the signs under each of the sort of overvalued side and undervalued side has been the most practical part of the entire program, because I think
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what we've done has been focused on understanding yourself better, reflecting on things in the past, or kind of like talking about your intentions in the future, and kind of like directing your goals and your milestones, which we might talk about in a future podcast. But I think one of the things that's been so valuable about writing the signs of when you're going over the edge on either side is it actually gives you a practical map on how to find balance under that value. And so I'll maybe talk about one of the examples that I have for my very first value. So it was being visionary. So I value being visionary. And so when I undervalue that, how I kind of articulated it is sort of becoming short sighted. And
Mm.
some of the signs that I kind of look out for is like when I'm getting overwhelmed by large problems, because I typically like to
Mm.
be sitting in the space of vision and possibility and all of these sh-
Yeah.
big yet somewhat lofty questions. And so when I find that those things are kind of like overwhelming me, it's a good sign that I'm kind of undervaluing this aspect of myself. And then another one that I'll also just touch on is making decisions making the decisions that lead me back to a place that I've worked to get out of is kind of like when I'm falling back into my old habits or patterns, is a surefire sign that I'm kind of not looking far enough ahead and not sort of leaning into this specific value.
Yeah.
And maybe one more sort of sign that I'm sort of undervaluing this aspect of being visionary is kind of like, I think a lot of the times when I'm feeling insecure or doubting, specifically doubting my intuition, is a sign that I'm not looking far enough ahead and I'm not like leaning into this
Mm.
specific aspect of myself. And then
Yeah.
sort of flipping it over onto the other side of things, when I overvalue being visionary, is sort of like getting to a point where I'm being delusional.
Delusional.
And so, yeah. And so
Oh, I love that.
a couple of the things that I kind of mentioned about that, and I have to say that this part was was a little bit difficult, because it's also one of the things that I kind of pride myself in about myself. But first is sort of ignoring evidence and this sort of aspect of willing blindness. And I think
Mm.
you almost kind of, it's a hard balance to strike, because there is an aspect of kind of being optimistic and visionary that requires you to maybe not ignore but at least discount possible threats or obstacles. And I think
Yeah.
when I'm completely just ignoring them, that's a sign that I may be overvaluing this specific aspect.
Mm.
And then the other one is, and it's very much on the same sort of line of reasoning, is like an irrational optimism. It's like, it's one thing to sort of have, you know two possibilities, one being a little bit optimistic and one a little bit more cynical, and leaning towards something optimistic for the benefit that it provides. But being optimistic without reason is maybe taking it a little bit too far. And then I think the last one is kind of like getting attached to potential. It's like
Mm.
often I'll sort of see something where I see a lot of potential, and it's one of the reasons why I value this aspect of being visionary, is that it sort of allows you to identify and realize potential. But sometimes you can get so attached to that potential that you stop seeing what the price of it is and what you're sort of losing as a result to kind of being attached to it and kind of saying, try again, try again, try again. It's like sometimes,
Mhm.
you just need to cut your losses and let them float along the river.
Yep. Pivot.
Yeah. Um,
Pivot. Don't persevere, Alfie. To call back to the last episode.
which is crazy because it's just funny to see, like, with all of the space now, looking at how some of the parts of the process in terms of identifying values were actually realized in some of the frameworks that we used in the second half of the program. We talked a little bit about, as you sort of, brought up now, this idea of pivot or persevere. Like, in sort of
Mhm.
defining my values, I kind of get to see how I typically behave when I'm faced with a question of pivot or persevere, and kind of
Yeah.
what to look out for when I may be going off track a little bit.
Yeah, I never thought about that association, but you're right. Huh.
It's
I mean,
pretty
we did
cool.
that on purpose, obviously. Obviously, this is all planned. We're masterminding it the whole time. No, but I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about. I also think that, like, when our students were making the decision of whether to pivot or persevere, like the set of instructions, like operating instructions for their life that they were using for that was these continuums, because it was sort of like at that point you had those, and so you're looking at those and making a decision of whether or not to go one way or another. So yeah, having this as like an input, I hadn't thought about that, but that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that kind of brings us at least to the end of the material which we were posing to our students at this sort of point in time.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be cool for us to explore some of these as we kind of go further into this process. But I think for
Yeah.
today, I am going to ask us our repeated and very valued question. Abby,
Mm.
at this point in time, how made sense of are you?
I, at some point, I imagine we'll have enough episodes that there can actually be like a B roll of just my reactions to that question every single time. Because every single time, it's like, just so everyone knows, like, it's on a list that I know is coming. Like, I knew 30 seconds ago, maybe even a minute ago, I knew he was going to ask me this question. And I still don't know the answer until he asked me. So I feel, in some ways, I feel more myself than I have ever been before. And I feel like I am standing in more authenticity than I've ever sat before. I'm surrounded by more community. I am able to give more kindness. I have more curiosity, and I'm being more playful than ever. So I feel like, from a value standpoint, like, things are looking up. But man, change is freaking hard. Like, you just, I think you and I have talked about spirals a bunch recently, and just not like emotional spirals, although we could talk about those too. But just like the metaphor of a spiral, where, like, kind of think that recovering from something or changing yourself is going to be this like straight line where you're just going to keep getting better and better, stronger and stronger. And it's just not. It's more like a spiral staircase where you're just like coming around the same thing, and you are getting further, but you're also like making the same loop, and it might be ever so slightly higher or smaller, but it doesn't feel any freaking different sometimes. So yeah, I would say I'm like mid spiral staircase currently. I'm just like, I know that what's at the end of this staircase is what I want, and I know that I have the tools and the community and the support to get there, but I am tired, and I wish I was there quicker. So yeah, I think that's how I am right now. How about you? How made sense of you are you these days?
Yeah, it's never easy to answer this question because it can go in so many different directions. But if I were to sort of take a little bit of a snapshot of where I am, I would say I have given a good attempt at a lot of the things I was hoping to do last year, some of which were successful, some of which weren't so successful. And so I would say I'm sort of like at the close of one of the the trips around the spiral.
Mm.
And so I would say I can't necessarily say whether I'm totally made sense of, but I can definitely say there are a couple of things that I've crossed off the list, which sort of now kind of require further evaluation, reflection, goal setting,
Yeah.
you know, all of the above. But I would say definitely progress. But yeah,
Good. Can we
yeah.
hear about the dinner party?
Yes, 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 yes.
I thought you
I
were
think
going to
that
get away. You're like, you want to
you
get away
got
with
me.
not telling this.
Yeah. So
Well,
one of the
first, remind us
things.
about the progress on the dinner party, because I feel like that's an important part of telling us about the dinner party. Is like talk about the first dinner party.
So in this process, we talked a little bit about the idea of the values that we had, and kind of like what we. Okay, so let me sort of roll back a little bit. So I think the next stage, and hopefully what we might be able to talk about in one of our future episodes, is how we kind of like turn some of these values into something intentional. But a significant part of what came out of doing this values work was me sort of realizing that a significant part of what I was hoping for was centered around this idea of rebuilding like a social fabric, especially because I am such a social person and I like to engage with people a lot. It's something that really stuck with me and stuck with a lot of the values that I came up with. And so one of the things that I kind of decided to do in terms of taking action towards this was one step towards rebuilding that social fabric was inviting a couple of people to sort of to have a little bit of a dinner, have a bit of a discussion, and see if we could kind of do so in a way that was authentic, but also allowed people to kind of like unwind a little bit, because I think too often we kind of find ourselves only talking about work, or you kind of do the typical spiel when you kind of have these kind of situations. And so the first step I took towards process was hosting this dinner, and you might say it had its bumps. You might say. I'm not going to get into too much detail about what went wrong, because those are not necessarily all my stories to tell. But I will say I maybe pushed a couple of people a little bit further out of their comfort zone than is helpful, especially among a group of strangers.
Mhm.
And it was a difficult thing for me to kind of face, is because I think, especially because I find myself to be good at facilitating something that I enjoy. I'm highly extroverted, so it's sort of like you expect that you're just gonna have this dinner and everyone's gonna love it and it's all gonna go great, and that wasn't necessarily the case. So I kind of had to eat a little bit of humble pie, take a little bit of a step back, and see what went wrong. And I remember at the close of the program, I kind of asked some of the students for like advice on, this was my milestone. It didn't really go super well. Like, what do they think? And one of the great pieces of advice that I got was like, maybe you need a partner, like a co-facilitator for these dinners. And so, fast forward 6 months, I am now doing a weekly dinner discussion every Friday. And I have a couple of different sort of co-hosts for these dinner discussions, but more importantly is like I'm starting to see how to rebuild that fabric. And it's like, if you meet a group of people and have a meaningful discussion every week, that is going to make a significant difference towards the social fabric that you find yourself in. So I would say,
Yeah.
from a practical perspective, though a lot of the reflections and the thoughts and all of that might feel a little bit abstract and metaphorical, if you kind of take this on with an intention to grow, you can actually make some real progress. And it's only really now looking back that that sort of milestone example could actually turn into a significant part of my weekly life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
So
I'm so glad that you persevered. Like I feel like that. Well, I mean, just to bring it back, like we talked about how important community is to when things go wrong, and I feel like if you had run that dinner party at a time in your life where you didn't have enough community and people to talk about it. In this case, it happened to be our students, which I think is really cool because this was happening while we were teaching. But yeah, if that had happened when you were just by yourself, you might have just been like, oh, that was a terrible idea. I'm not doing that again. That was way uncomfortable. And I don't want to make people uncomfortable. And like, screw it. That was fun to do once and I'll never do it again. And to think that like, instead you were able to persevere and like also give it the time and make changes to it. Like not just do it again the same way, but to change it in ways that would impact it. So yeah, I don't remember which of the students gave you the idea to get a co-host, but shout out to them because that's
And
awesome.
maybe just one other thing that I would also add on that is sort of like, you know, it didn't just happen overnight. It was sort of like I got a little bit of
No.
advice. The one piece was getting a co-host, and then I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the students also recommended a great book called The Art of the Gathering. And
Yes.
that was one of the ones that I read. There were a whole bunch of books that I read on the back of that to kind of like learn
Yeah.
like what went wrong, how to do it a little bit better, and like I now feel like I have the tools to kind of get it right. And so, you know,
Hmm. I
progress.
remember having a great conversation about when we were talking to the students that day, when we were using you as the group coaching example. We talked about how you were surprised by how different people felt about that level of vulnerability and how like you were fine just being thrown into that level of vulnerability with like barely any or no notice versus like other people, myself included, during that session. I remember being like, oh my gosh, no, I would have to know that you were going to do that. You didn't tell them ahead you were doing this. So I feel like that was also like a good example of like, yeah, just getting like different perspectives on what you're doing can save you a lot of, heartache from seeing it happen in real time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear
100.
that. I hadn't heard the update that it had turned into a weekly. So I'm thrilled to hear that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's only become weekly very recently.
No, that's so cool. I'm glad to hear it live on this podcast for the first time. That's
Yeah.
cool.
And so maybe, you know, for us to kind of wind things up, we can take a little bit of a step out of making sense of ourselves. And Abby, it would be great to hear a little bit of how things are going for you in terms of the club.
Oh, it's so cool. We are coming to the last week of our first month. So we have almost gotten to the place where I can say every one of our discussion groups has met at least once with members. There's been some surprising things, a couple of metrics that I've been watching. One was I was really interested to see if members would dive right in or if it would be a lot of discussions that were just discussion leaders. So similar to the ones that we had in May, if it would just be the same. I have not seen a meeting yet where we didn't have a member show up. And it's the case also that we almost every single meeting have somebody who it's their first meeting, which is so fun. And so, yeah, that's been really cool to see. It's been awesome to see like how the training has come forward. Like it was easy to believe that the training was working when we were testing this with ourselves. But now that it's actually like real people who were not trained as discussion leaders benefiting from those skills, I think that yeah, I think the proof is really coming out in the pudding, which is super cool. In July, we are going to be doing our first public conversation. So the salon was sort of like a preview of what that's going to be like. But for July, we're actually going to be focusing on disability pride is in July. And so we are going to be having a guest discussion leader who's going to teach us about writing letters to corporations to represent how their websites are not accessible to those with disabilities. So if anyone is interested in our letter writing campaign, we'll be getting together on a Monday in July for that. And yeah, I think that it's been a real lesson in community building. Like I think we're up to about 80 people right now in the community, and we're averaging like 8 or 9 per discussion. So it's felt really good. It's felt really healthy. I'll be really interested to see what the second month looks like and sort of how that energy translates. But yeah, I think it's been surprising in some really cool ways and hard in some other surprising ways. But yeah, just to close us down, I want to say about this podcast, like if you are still listening to this podcast an hour in, think about how you might support it further. Like, follow us on all the platforms that you can follow us. Maybe leave a review. I don't think we've gotten a review yet. So you could be the very first person that reviews our podcast. We're always going to remember your name if you are the first person to review our podcast. I want to point that out. And then sharing, like, Alfie and I are only so powerful when it comes to the algorithms. So share our posts with the newest episodes. If we say something on here that means something to you, we would love to hear from you. You can email us, you can DM us, you can send a carrier pigeon, one to South Africa, one to Florida, and see which one gets there first. But yeah, we'd love to hear from you. I think this is our fourth episode, and we've heard like smatterings of people are listening. We haven't heard a lot yet, so we'd love to hear how you're making sense of yourself and how it's going over there. And until then, be clear.